So there are three phases of Buddhism: the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana, which is also called the Diamond or Indestructible Path, and it's also called the Tantrayana or Tantric Vehicle. And then what we're looking at here in the cave at Ajanta is an example of this second phase of Buddhism, the Mahayana, where images of the Buddha and other deities are starting to be introduced. So some of these cave facades had a relief with images of Buddha and other deities, showing the kind of the scenes from the Buddha's life. So a little more information about this first phase, the Hinayana. Um, you can read along with that, or I can tell you the other synopsis of it is that um, it's based on the belief that the release from suffering can only be achieved through personal effort and learning, and that the goal is individual salvation. The Buddha is regarded as a historical person, an earthly man, and a teacher, and he's not a transcendent being. And there's a clear monastic tradition associated with Hinayana, as noted through the numerous rock-cut monasteries that were created during this period at Baja and Karo. So understanding the Buddha's journey and the knowledge is primary. Worship of the deities is secondary. So the Dharma is really highly revered and the Buddha himself is not. So the simple concept everyone focuses on is the release from samsara. And that's shown in examples that we studied earlier, like the Bodhi tree is a symbol, the Kakra is a symbol, and the Stupa is a symbol. And then his footprints, so representing his absence, those things are a little bit more important during the Hinayana time. So that second phase is the Mahayana, and it's rooted in the teachings of the historical Buddha, but it seeks salvation for all beings. The Mahayana places less emphasis on the monastery and monastic life because they believe that through direct worship and assistance from a bodhisattva, an individual can attain release. And a bodhisattva is this important figure that refers to an enlightened being who's achieved Buddhahood, or moksha, the release from samsara, but they choose to remain in the temporal world or our regular world in order to assist other people. And that's seen as the ultimate form of compassion. And this is around the time that we start seeing images of bodhisattvas start to come out and more images of Buddha start to come out. So here are some of the early examples of Buddhist imagery coming through on these Kushan coins. This comes around in the year 100 CE. This is a pretty standard image of the Buddha during the Mahayana phase. It was established in Mutra, Madhya Pradesh, India. Artists were already familiar with sculpting the human image in stone. They were doing this with kings and attendants as early as the Hindu time. But for the images of Buddha, they referred to all of the canonical literature that had described what the Buddha looks like. So he's a religious leader, so thus he's wearing this religious garb, these kind of draping clothes. He's always facing forward, it's always a frontal view, and he's always on a throne, usually with lions to support from beneath. So another example of this is the yogic seal. There's a two-tiered formation, and it's pretty standard for the seated Buddha. So he exists up in the transcendental world, as indicated by this upper tier, with larger figures that inhabit the space. And then the lower tier is considered the mundane world, and it's usually inhabited by either lions or deer or devotees. And this seal depicts him seated in what is referred to as that meditation pose or the lotus pose. And this is Buddha and attendants. It's a stele. And it's a great object to kind of get the detail of the iconography aspects that are associated with images of Buddha. So the most common characteristic included on the Buddha are the urna, which is his third eye, symbolizing the ability to see past our mundane universe and suffering. That's the urna is located right there. Next is the Ushanisha, which is the cranial bump. It's a symbol of Buddha's omniscience, which was later transformed through the centuries into kind of a top knot or a bun on top of his head. And then he has these elongated and empty earlobes that refer to the past of wearing heavy and expensive jewelry. But we want to note the absence of that jewelry, but what's left behind is the stretched and elongated earlobe. And then the chakras at the soles of his feet and hands, or wheels. If he's seated, he's always depicted in the full lotus pose. Buddha and other Buddhist deities are also depicted with halos. And this is a symbol that may have originated during the Kushan Empire under the king Kushanishka. And then later it spreads over to the West and then gets adopted and utilized in Christian visual culture, as you'll probably remember from the previous European section and modules. You'll notice that his hand is up in a position called a mudra. It's the hand gesture of the Buddha that are fixed at the origin of the very first human image of the Buddha. They're transferred in a variety they're transferred to a bunch of other deities as well during the introduction of Buddhism through the Mahayana Buddhist phase. So some of these mudras include fear not, the gift bestowing gesture, the earth touching gesture, that Dharma Kakra mudra from the first sermon that we looked at earlier, the meditation or balance mudra, and then the greeting or prayer mudra. These are all hand positions that are often found in Buddhist art. So in Gandhara, which is a northwest frontier of the Kushan Empire, you can start to see that there's this Roman influence that's developing. It's depicted in the art through this kind of Roman sculptural style of drapery. We can remember that from the module on Roman art and sculpture. So you can see that there's this cultural exchange between Greco-Roman world and the Kushan Empire. This is a pretty good comparison between the Mathura Madhya Pradesh Buddha in attendance and then the Buddha in attendance in Gandhara, which is in northwest Pakistan. Just shows an example of the kind of trade routes that are really close to these monasteries and how these kind of cultural influences are starting to spread. And this is readily available when you compare the standard seating type to this newer standing image of the Buddha, as seen in the standing Gandhran Buddha, which is not as popular. The treatment of the robe is particularly characteristic of the Gandharan style. These folds are tight and rib-like, clinging to the body, emphasizing the Buddha's belly and the bend of his left knee. This complex folding pattern, including the asymmetrical U shape right here, is also found on the togas in Roman statues, as you can see right there in the imperial procession. So since the 4th century, pockets of the Hellenistic culture were thriving in present-day Afghanistan and southern Uzbekistan, when the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, were reaching over to the borders of India. Also, Gandhara's position near the east-west trade routes also seem to have stimulated a lot of this contact with the Roman culture. So in the year 320 Common Era, after the breakup of the Kushan Empire, we start to see the international Gupta style. Northern India gets divided into a number of petty kingdoms. One of them is ruled by Gupta. The Guptas were Hindus, but they contributed to the support of both Buddhism and Jainism. In fact, one of the last great rulers built a monastery at the famous Buddhist center of Nalanda in Bihar. The Gupta and the post Gupta artists of Bengal transmitted this Mahayana Buddhist imagery all over Indonesia. So it was a time of cultural expansion and colonialism, which saw the influence of Indian art and ideas extending through Central Asia to China, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia. These were, with the exception of the Pala and Sena schools of Bihar, the kind of considered the last great days of Buddhist art in India. So as Hinduism started to displace Buddhism in India, the future of art, like that of the faith, started to move eastward. So, because of its dominance, Gupta sculpture is established as this new standard type of Buddha image. That can be seen here. This is called the Mathura style, and it's found in Uttar Pradesh. It presents this softened continuation of the harsh Kushan style. So it's typically made of the red Mathuran sandstone, into which details can be worked out with little refinement. And the Sarnath, seen here in the first sermon, is the second style, and it utilizes this cream-colored sandstone that can be worked with a high degree of finish and detail. So the Pala dynasty in northern India was the last greatest Buddhist dynasty, as we said, supported by large, thriving monastic communities from the year 750 to 1174 CE. But it was destroyed by the Mongols in the 12th century. So some two surviving examples from the Pala dynasty are this seated Buddha at Enlightenment from the 10th century, and the seated Buddha teaching the Dharma, or his first sermon, from the 11th century. And the focus of these two still is on the Buddha, but the two attendant figures are his bodhisattvas that indicate that the Pala dynasty was following the Mahayana practice. Since bodhisattvas remain connected to the mundane world, they still wear clothing and ornamentation that indicates this attachment. So they wear earrings, they have arm and leg bands, they wear decorative dhotis. They rarely sit in full lotus position like the Buddha, who sits with his legs crossed in a position of permanent enlightenment, unable to directly aid the Buddhist practitioner. These bodhisattvas sit in half lotus with one foot unbent and resting on a lotus footstool. That way, whenever they're called upon, they're able to really quickly rise into a standing position and go to the aid of a practitioner in distress. An example of this is Tara. She's a bodhisattva. Her name means star or guide. She's also known as the savioress. She saves practitioners from the obstacles of daily life. Her popular form is the Tara of the 8 Great Perils, each with a mundane as well as transcendental facet. So here, lions are here representing a threat someone may face that Tara can save him or her from. Lions can also represent pride, which can stand in the way of a practitioner's goal of enlightenment. So we'll close by talking about the Bamiyan Buddhas that were constructed along the Silk Road. This is the intercontinental trade route that kind of gets established, connecting east and west. Along this trade route is the Bamiyan Valley in Afghanistan. There's a great video you can watch for more information on these Buddhas, but as you can see, they're huge. These colossal Buddhas were placed along the Silk Road so that travelers could ascend a staircase to the level of the shoulders of the smaller of the two and follow a ledge, allowing for circumambulation of the Buddha's head. Inside the niche that enclosed the head was a painting of the sun. So these Buddhas were destroyed. They don't exist anymore. As you can see, there's a just gaping hole where they were. What happened was the Taliban commander Abdul Wahed announced his intention to blow up the Buddhas in 1997 prior to taking control of the valley. Once he was in control of Bamiyan, He drilled holes in the Buddha's head for the explosives, but this was overruled by Mullah Omar. And then in 1999, Mullah Muhammad Omar issued a decree in favor of preserving the Buddhas. Oh, we're gonna run out of time. Shoot.